Single mother Catalina Vasquez thought the abandoned silver mine she bought for $200 at a county tax auction in remote Nevada was just a desperate gamble to secure cheap land where she could park her trailer and homeschool her twin daughters without rent payments crushing what remained of her disability benefits. But when her 8-year-old daughter Isabella discovered a hidden chamber behind a false wall in the mine's entrance tunnel, Catalina uncovered something impossible, an intact Mayan ceremonial vault containing a jade artifact that archaeologists had declared mythical, along with Spanish colonial documents proving that the mine had been deliberately abandoned in 1542 to conceal evidence of a genocide that could rewrite North American history and expose a centuries-old cover-up involving the Vatican, European banking dynasties, and modern mining conglomerates worth hundreds of billions of dollars. This is the story of how a $200 tax auction purchase and one curious child's exploration transformed a broke, disabled veteran into the guardian of a relic so valuable that governments have murdered entire bloodlines to keep it hidden. The December wind swept across the Mojave Desert like a predator seeking wounded prey, carrying with it the bitter scent of alkali dust and the promise of another brutal winter night that would test the structural integrity of the ancient propane heater Catalina Vasquez had been coaxing to life for the past 4 months, its blue flame dancing with the same uncertainty that characterized everything else in her existence that seemed designed to collapse at precisely the moment when failure would cause maximum devastation to her family's already precarious circumstances. At 36 years old and 2 years removed from her medical discharge from the Marine Corps, she stood before the rusted steel gate that surrounded the Luna Perdida mine, a silver extraction operation that had been abandoned since the 1960s and represented either the most catastrophic financial mistake of her adult life or the only remaining pathway to housing stability she could afford with the $623 remaining in her checking account after purchasing winter clothing for her twin daughters. The property encompassed 63 acres of high desert wasteland that the Nye County tax assessor had designated as worthless for agricultural development, mineral extraction potential, or residential construction possibilities, making it theoretically perfect for someone whose monthly disability payments barely covered basic nutrition for her 8-year-old twins, while providing nothing for the escalating rent demands that had been systematically eliminating affordable housing options within a 100-mile radius of Las Vegas's expanding metropolitan development zones. The mine complex consisted of deteriorating prefabricated buildings, collapsed ventilation structures, and entrance tunnels that had been sealed with reinforced concrete barriers decades earlier by mining corporations that had extracted everything of commercial value before abandoning the property to whichever unfortunate individual might prove desperate enough to assume legal responsibility for environmental cleanup obligations and property tax assessments on land that generated nothing except ongoing liability. Catalina's financial mathematics had achieved the kind of brutal precision that eliminated all possibility of optimistic forecasting or creative debt management strategies that might delay the inevitable conclusion that her disability income couldn't sustain independent housing for a family of 3 in a state where affordable residential options had become as fictional as profitable small-scale mining operations in the contemporary global economy. Her medical separation from the Marines had provided comprehensive health care coverage for service-connected disabilities resulting from roadside bomb injuries sustained during her 3rd deployment to Afghanistan, but had simultaneously eliminated the predictable income and family housing allowances that had made single motherhood navigable within institutional frameworks designed to accommodate the complex logistical requirements of raising children while fulfilling professional obligations to national defense. The twins, Isabella and Esperanza, had been born during her final tour of duty, their arrival transforming military career planning into an intricate balance between combat readiness requirements and maternal responsibilities that their biological father had abandoned the moment pregnancy complications had interfered with his plans to complete law school without the inconvenience of supporting children whose existence would have required acknowledgement of relationship commitments he'd never intended to honor beyond casual romantic entertainment during periods of leave from military deployment cycles. Marine Corps single motherhood had presented significant challenges, but had remained manageable within institutional frameworks that provided child care support, medical services, educational resources, and community networks specifically designed to assist military families navigating the intersection of professional service requirements and family stability needs. Base housing, commissary privileges, military family support groups, and deployment childcare programs had created an environment where raising twins while maintaining combat readiness was difficult but achievable with proper planning and utilization of available support systems.
Civilian transition had systematically dismantled those support networks while introducing variables that military training couldn't address effectively. Landlords who viewed families with children as rental risks, employers who interpreted service-connected disabilities as insurance liability concerns, and educational bureaucracies that weren't equipped to accommodate children whose mothers' post-traumatic stress symptoms made conventional school involvement problematic during periods when crowded public spaces triggered anxiety responses that interfered with sustained participation in parent-teacher conferences, school board meetings, and community social activities requiring consistent emotional regulation in unpredictable environments. Her PTSD manifestations were specific and manageable with proper environmental controls. Hypervigilance in unfamiliar locations, startle responses to unexpected loud noises, and anxiety reactions in situations where exit routes weren't clearly identified or where large groups of people created tactical disadvantages that triggered combat assessment protocols inappropriate for civilian social interactions. These symptoms were entirely compatible with effective parenting and professional competence when she could control environmental variables, but became problematic in employment situations that required sustained performance in unpredictable social environments or educational settings that demanded regular participation in crowded meetings and public events. The Luna Perdida mine had materialized on the county tax auction database like a logistical solution specifically designed for her family's unique circumstances. Abandoned industrial property with clear legal title, no active environmental enforcement proceedings, no outstanding liens or legal complications, and a minimum bid amount that corresponded exactly to her available resources without eliminating her capacity to purchase food, fuel, and essential supplies for the remainder of the winter heating season. The property description included references to mineral rights conveyed with sale and existing structures suitable for storage and workshop applications, suggesting potential revenue opportunities that could justify the investment even if the land proved unsuitable for permanent residential development. Her investigation into the mine's operational history had revealed the standard pattern of resource extraction cycles that characterized Nevada's mining heritage throughout the 20th century. Periods of intensive silver production during wartime metal demand, followed by operational suspension when ore deposits became economically unviable, or when international market fluctuations made continued domestic extraction unprofitable relative to foreign sources with lower labor costs and reduced environmental compliance requirements. The Luna Perdida had functioned as a productive silver mine from 1943 through 1967, contributing modestly to American strategic metal reserves during World War II and the early Cold War period, before ceasing operations when environmental regulations and foreign competition had rendered smaller domestic mining enterprises economically unfeasible. However, specific details about the mine's closure timeline presented inconsistencies that didn't align with broader patterns of Nevada mining industry development during the late 1960s. Most comparable operations had continued production into the mid-1970s before succumbing to economic pressures, while the Luna Perdida had been abandoned abruptly in 1967, despite geological surveys indicating that significant silver reserves remained accessible through existing tunnel systems and that extraction costs were within profitable parameters according to prevailing market conditions. The operational cessation had apparently occurred without the gradual workforce reduction or equipment liquidation that typically preceded planned mining closures, suggesting circumstances that had required immediate discontinuation of activities rather than orderly business wind-down procedures. County property records documented that the mine had remained in complex legal ownership arrangements for decades following closure, with title transfers between various corporate entities that appeared to exist exclusively for maintaining minimal tax obligations while preventing public access to facilities that could have been repurposed for alternative commercial or residential applications. The corporate ownership evolution suggested deliberate efforts to maintain legal control over supposedly valueless desert property rather than simple abandonment due to lack of ongoing commercial interest, raising questions about why multiple business entities would invest resources in preserving exclusive access to terrain that generated no revenue and require ongoing tax payments without apparent benefit.
But her immediate survival priorities couldn't accommodate curiosity about historical mysteries when her primary concern involved establishing winter shelter for her daughters before desert temperature fluctuations made tent camping with children a form of neglect that could justify intervention by social services agencies, whose involvement would create complications far more threatening than corporate conspiracy theories about abandoned mining properties. Her plan was straightforward: establish basic camping infrastructure on the property while exploring possibilities for converting existing structures into permanent housing that would eliminate rent obligations and provide stable educational environment for homeschooling arrangements that could continue her daughter's academic development without the social complications that traditional schools created for military children adjusting to civilian community integration. The tax option had proceeded exactly according to her projections. No competing bidders had appeared for property that represented ongoing liability rather than investment opportunity to anyone employing conventional real estate evaluation criteria, allowing her to secure ownership with her minimum $200 bid while preserving sufficient resources to purchase essential equipment, including backup generator, water storage capacity, winter clothing, and emergency food supplies that would make desert residents survivable until spring weather conditions reduced their heating and shelter requirements to manageable levels. Her daughters had adapted to their unconventional living situation with the resilience that military children develop through experience with frequent relocations, temporary housing arrangements, and environmental uncertainty that civilian children typically didn't encounter until much later in their psychological development. Isabella and Esperanza had transformed their tent camping experience into an extended adventure, approaching daily survival tasks with enthusiasm that made their circumstances feel like elaborate games rather than desperate poverty management strategies. Isabella, the more analytically inclined twin, had appointed herself as expedition logistics coordinator, maintaining detailed lists of water consumption, food inventory, and weather pattern observations in notebooks that she designated as official family record-keeping systems. Her organizational tendencies and systematic approach to problem-solving reflected personality characteristics that Catalina recognized from her own military training, suggesting that Isabella possessed natural leadership capabilities that could serve her well regardless of their family's eventual economic circumstances. Esperanza displayed different strengths that complemented her sister's analytical focus: intuitive social intelligence, creative problem-solving approaches, and environmental awareness that allowed her to identify resources and opportunities that systematic analysis might overlook. She had demonstrated remarkable ability to locate water sources, identify edible desert plants, and predict weather changes through observation of animal behavior patterns and atmospheric conditions that her Marine Corps survival trainee had taught Catalina to monitor, but that Esperanza seemed to understand instinctively. The twins' adaptation to their circumstances had been more successful than Catalina had anticipated, suggesting that their temporary housing situation might be sustainable for extended periods if she could establish reliable income sources and convert existing mine structures into permanent residential facilities that would meet basic safety and educational requirements. Their homeschooling progress had actually accelerated since leaving conventional educational environments that had created social stress and behavioral problems related to their family's military background and unconventional living arrangements. But Isabella's discovery had transformed practical survival planning into something that challenged fundamental assumptions about Nevada history, archaeological science, and the motivations behind corporate interests that had invested decades of resources maintaining exclusive control over supposedly worthless desert property. Her daughter's natural curiosity and complete disregard for adult safety concerns had led to exploration of areas that previous property owners had apparently expended considerable effort to keep inaccessible, revealing concealment measures that exceeded anything justified by normal industrial operations or environmental liability management. The morning of the discovery had begun with typical single-mother crisis coordination, Esperanza developing respiratory symptoms that required medical evaluation, their backup generator malfunctioning despite Catalina's preventative maintenance efforts, and Isabella vanishing from their campsite with the kind of 8-year-old confidence that interpreted adult warnings about mine safety as interesting information rather than non-negotiable behavioral restrictions. Catalina had been troubleshooting electrical system failures that threatened their heating capabilities when she'd heard Isabella's voice echoing from somewhere within the supposedly sealed mine entrance, carrying excitement rather than distress, but originating from locations that should have been inaccessible due to concrete barriers that county safety officials had installed to prevent exactly this type of unauthorized exploration.
Following her daughter's voice through gaps in the concrete ceiling that revealed sophisticated efforts to maintain concealed access while preventing casual discovery, Catalina had located Isabella standing in a chamber that contradicted everything she had been informed about the mine's construction history, operational parameters, and geological characteristics that had justified silver extraction activities during the property's documented mining periods. The chamber displayed architectural sophistication inappropriate for industrial mining operations, construction techniques that predated 1940s engineering capabilities, and preservation conditions that couldn't have been maintained through random abandonment when the mine ceased operations in 1967. The chamber's dimensions were too precisely calculated for mining tunnel construction, its wall surfaces too carefully finished for utilitarian industrial purposes, and its environmental conditions too carefully controlled to represent accidental preservation of space that should have deteriorated significantly during decades of abandonment in desert climate conditions that destroyed most organic materials and caused structural degradation in poorly maintained underground facilities. But Isabella's specific discovery within the chamber had eliminated Catalina's capacity for rational analysis and forced her to confront the possibility that their $200 property purchase had connected them to secrets that individuals and institutions with unlimited resources and legal authority had invested centuries in ensuring remained concealed beneath Nevada desert terrain, where systematic archaeological investigation could be prevented through property ownership strategies that kept academic researchers away from discoveries that could fundamentally alter understanding of North American colonial history and contemporary international power structures. Isabella's discovery had eliminated Catalina's capacity for rational analysis and forced her to confront the possibility that their $200 property purchase had connected them to secrets that individuals and institutions with unlimited resources and legal authority had invested centuries in ensuring remained concealed beneath Nevada desert terrain, where systematic archaeological investigation could be prevented through property ownership strategies that kept academic researchers away from discoveries that could fundamentally alter understanding of North American colonial history and contemporary international power structures. Isabella's discovery had fundamentally altered everything Catalina thought she knew about North American history, European colonization patterns, and indigenous cultural development in a way that could affect contemporary international relations, economic structures, and political power distributions in ways that threatened established institutions
and the individuals whose wealth and authority depended on maintaining current historical narratives. But the immediate practical considerations overwhelmed philosophical speculation about historical revisionism when Catalina realized that their discovery had potentially made them targets for people with resources and capabilities that exceeded anything available through conventional law enforcement or legal protection systems. If powerful interests had invested centuries in concealing whatever Isabella had found, then a disabled veteran living in a tent with two 8-year-old daughters represented exactly the type of vulnerable threat that such organizations would eliminate without hesitation or moral consideration. As Catalina helped Isabella document their discovery while simultaneously planning for the possibility that their family's survival might depend on immediate evacuation from property that seemed like salvation but might prove to be the most dangerous place they could possibly have chosen for refuge, Catalina understood that their $200 investment had connected them to secrets whose value could either provide unprecedented security for her daughter's future or could result in their disappearance into the Nevada desert, where missing persons cases involving transient families were rarely investigated with sufficient resources to identify perpetrators with unlimited wealth and institutional protection.
Isabella's voice echoed through the sealed mine entrance with an acoustic clarity that defied the concrete barriers and rusted steel reinforcement that county safety inspectors had installed in 1968 to prevent exactly this type of unauthorized exploration by curious children whose parents lacked the resources to supervise them adequately during extended camping situations on abandoned industrial properties. The sound carried peculiar resonance characteristics that suggested her daughter was speaking from within a much larger space than the collapsed tunnel systems that geological surveys had documented during the mine's final operational assessment, when corporate engineers had determined that remaining silver deposits were insufficient to justify continued extraction costs and environmental compliance expenses. Catalina's military training had developed her ability to assess acoustic environments for tactical advantages and potential threats, making her immediately aware that the sound patterns reaching her ears were inconsistent with what she understood about the Luna Perdita mine's internal structure based on county records, environmental impact studies, and mining company documentation that had been filed with federal agencies when the property was abandoned nearly 60 years earlier. Isabella's voice was reaching her through openings that shouldn't exist according to official closure procedures, suggesting either catastrophic structural failures that had compromised the concrete ceiling systems or deliberate modifications that had maintained concealed access points while preserving the appearance of complete closure. Following the sound through gaps in the barrier system that required careful navigation around jagged concrete edges and twisted steel reinforcement, Catalina discovered that the mine's entrance tunnel extended much further into the hillside than property surveys had indicated, with construction characteristics that were inconsistent with 1940s industrial mining techniques and safety standards that had governed silver extraction operations throughout Nevada during the wartime production period. The tunnel walls showed hand-carved stonework that displayed craftsmanship far exceeding utilitarian mining requirements, with decorative elements and architectural details that belonged to ceremonial or religious construction rather than industrial infrastructure designed for efficient ore extraction and transportation systems. The stonework showed fossilized marine organisms that were inconsistent with Nevada's geological history, indicating source locations that would have required sophisticated logistics and transportation capabilities to deliver massive stone blocks across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. But it was the tunnel's engineering specifications that challenged Catalina's understanding of historical construction capabilities and mining industry practices during the supposed operational period of the Luna Perdita mine. The passage maintained precise geometric proportions that exceeded typical mining tunnel requirements, with mathematical relationships between width, height,
and directional orientation that suggested astronomical or ceremonial significance rather than functional efficiency for silver ore extraction and underground transportation systems. The construction displayed knowledge of structural engineering principles that shouldn't have been available to mining operations in the 1940s, with arch designs and load distribution techniques that represented advanced architectural understanding typically associated with European cathedral construction or ancient Roman infrastructure projects. The air quality within the tunnel remained remarkably fresh despite decades of supposed closure, indicating ventilation systems that continued to function long after the mine's official abandonment. The airflow patterns suggested sophisticated circulation engineering that maintained optimal atmospheric conditions through mechanisms that weren't visible from the main passage, implying hidden ventilation shafts or mechanical systems that had been designed to operate independently of human maintenance for extended periods. The temperature remained constant despite external weather fluctuations, suggesting thermal regulation capabilities that exceeded what would be necessary or practical for industrial mining operations that typically functioned during limited shifts and seasonal schedules. Isabella's location became apparent as Catalina followed the tunnel through a series of turns that revealed increasingly sophisticated architectural elements, including carved relief panels that depicted scenes inconsistent with indigenous North American artistic traditions or European colonial decorative motifs typically found in mining operations established by settlers during the 19th and early 20th centuries. The relief work showed influences from multiple cultural traditions, with artistic elements that suggested contact between civilizations that academic historians claimed had never interacted in North American territorial contexts during pre-Columbian or early colonial periods.
The carved panels depicted activities that challenged established timelines of technological development and cultural interaction patterns in the North American Southwest. Images showed advanced metallurgical processes, architectural construction techniques, and transportation methods that academic consensus maintained hadn't been available to indigenous cultures before European contact, while simultaneously displaying cultural elements that European colonists wouldn't have encountered until much later periods of territorial expansion and cultural interaction with Mesoamerican civilizations. The artistic style combined Maya, Aztec, and European influences in ways that suggested sustained cultural contact and technological exchange rather than the brief violent encounters that historical records documented as characterizing most indigenous European interactions during early colonial periods. Following Isabella's continued calls, Catalina reached a chamber that eliminated any possibility of rational explanation based on conventional understanding of the Luna Perdida mine's construction history, operational parameters, or abandonment circumstances. The space was vast, approximately 40 feet in diameter and 20 feet in height, carved from solid bedrock with precision that required advanced excavation technology and engineering expertise that exceeded anything available to 1940s mining operations or contemporary construction capabilities in remote desert locations without access to specialized equipment and technical support. The chamber's walls had been finished with polished stone surfaces that reflected light with mirror-like clarity, creating illumination effects that transformed Isabella's flashlight beam into ambient lighting that revealed architectural details and decorative elements with startling clarity. The polished stone work had been executed with precision that matched the finest examples of European cathedral construction or ancient Roman architectural achievements, representing craftsmanship that required master artisans with decades of specialized training and access to tools and techniques that weren't available to industrial mining operations or typical colonial construction projects in North American frontier territories. But the chamber's most remarkable feature was its ceiling, which displayed astronomical mapping that depicted celestial configurations with accuracy that required advanced mathematical calculations and observational capabilities far exceeding what academic historians attributed to pre-Columbian indigenous cultures or early European colonial settlements in the North American Southwest. The astronomical chart showed star positions, planetary movements, and celestial cycles with precision that matched contemporary scientific observations, while incorporating mathematical relationships and geometric patterns that suggested understanding of advanced astronomical concepts that European science didn't develop until the Renaissance period. Isabella stood in the center of this impossible space, her 8-year-old presence dwarfed by architectural achievements that challenged fundamental assumptions about historical timelines, technological development patterns, and cultural interaction sequences that formed the foundation of academic understanding about North American colonial history and indigenous cultural achievements that this single chamber proved to be fundamentally incorrect. "Mom, look at this!" Isabella's voice carried the enthusiasm of scientific discovery, combined with the satisfaction of successful exploration that had revealed secrets hidden from adult investigation for decades or centuries. Her flashlight beam illuminated a raised platform in the chamber's center that supported an ornate pedestal constructed from the same polished stone that lined the walls, but decorated with metalwork that displayed craftsmanship exceeding anything Catalina had encountered in museums, historical sites, or archaeological exhibitions dedicated to pre-Columbian American cultures or early European colonial artifacts. The pedestal's metalwork incorporated gold, silver, and copper in alloy combinations that created surface effects and decorative patterns requiring metallurgical expertise that academic consensus maintained wasn't available to indigenous American cultures before European contact, while simultaneously displaying artistic influences that European colonists wouldn't have encountered until much later periods of territorial expansion and cultural interaction with Mesoamerican civilizations. The metal craftsmanship showed evidence of advanced techniques, including lost wax casting, precision engraving, and chemical treatments that produced surface coloration and protective finishes representing knowledge of metallurgical chemistry that European guilds had guarded as trade secrets during medieval and Renaissance periods. But it was the artifact resting on the pedestal that stopped Catalina's breathing and forced her to confront the possibility that Isabella's exploration had led them to discoveries that could reshape academic understanding of North American history, European colonial activities, and indigenous cultural achievements in ways that would challenge not just scholarly consensus, but contemporary political and economic relationships between nations whose modern boundaries and legal systems were based on historical assumptions about territorial claims, cultural development patterns, and technological capabilities that this single chamber proved to be fundamentally incorrect.
The artifact was a jade ceremonial mask that combined artistic influences from multiple civilizations in ways that suggested sustained cultural contact and technological exchange between societies that academic historians claimed had never interacted within North American territorial contexts. The jade itself was of exceptional quality, with translucent properties and color characteristics that indicated source locations in Mesoamerica rather than North American geological formations, suggesting trade relationships or transportation capabilities that could move precious materials across thousands of miles of difficult terrain during historical periods when such logistics were supposedly impossible for indigenous cultures or early European colonial settlements. The mask's artistic design incorporated Maya ceremonial elements, Aztec religious symbolism, and European decorative motifs in sophisticated combinations that represented not crude imitation or simple cultural borrowing, but advanced artistic synthesis that required intimate knowledge of multiple cultural traditions and religious practices. The craftsmanship quality matched the finest examples of Mesoamerican jade working that archaeologists had discovered in major ceremonial centers, while incorporating technical innovations and artistic elements that exceeded anything previously documented in academic literature dedicated to pre-Columbian American cultures or early European colonial artistic production. The mask's surface had been engraved with hieroglyphic inscriptions that combined Maya writing systems with symbols that appeared to represent European alphabetic characters, suggesting literacy capabilities and cultural interaction patterns that challenged established timelines of indigenous European contact and communication development. The inscriptions displayed mathematical concepts, astronomical calculations, and geographical references that indicated knowledge of territories, trade routes, and cultural centers throughout North and Central America, implying communication networks and transportation systems that academic consensus maintained hadn't existed during supposed pre-Columbian isolation periods or early colonial territorial restriction phases. But the inscriptions also included references that appeared to document specific historical events, including dates, locations, and personal names that could be cross-referenced with European colonial records and indigenous oral histories to verify the accuracy of information carved into jade surfaces centuries before such documentation methods were supposed to have been available to American indigenous cultures or early European frontier settlements. The historical references included detailed accounts of meetings between indigenous leaders and European representatives that weren't documented in official colonial records, suggesting systematic concealment of diplomatic relationships and treaty negotiations that could affect contemporary legal claims to territorial rights and resource extraction privileges throughout the North American Southwest. As Catalina examined the mask more closely, she realized that Isabella's discovery represented either the most sophisticated archaeological fraud in modern history or evidence of historical events and cultural relationships that powerful interests had invested centuries in concealing from public knowledge and scholarly investigation. The artifact's authenticity could be verified through scientific testing of materials, construction techniques, and artistic elements, but such verification would require involvement of academic institutions and governmental agencies whose response patterns might compromise her family's safety if the mask's implications threatened established historical narratives that supported contemporary political and economic power structures. The chamber contained additional artifacts arranged around the central pedestal, including ceremonial vessels, decorative weapons, and carved stone tablets that displayed similar combinations of cultural influences and technological capabilities that exceeded academic expectations for indigenous American civilizations or early European colonial settlements. Each artifact represented advanced craftsmanship and cultural knowledge that challenged specific aspects of established historical timelines, suggesting that the chamber had been designed as a comprehensive repository of evidence documenting cultural interactions and technological achievements that official historical records had systematically excluded from public knowledge or advanced to modern scientific investigation. The stone tablets contained what appeared to be detailed maps of North and Central America, showing territorial boundaries, trade routes, and settlement locations that were inconsistent with academic understanding of pre-Columbian indigenous territorial organization or early European colonial expansion patterns. The maps indicated knowledge of geographical features, natural resources, and transportation routes that suggested systematic exploration and mapping capabilities that academic consensus maintained hadn't existed during supposed pre-Columbian isolation periods or early European colonial territorial restriction phases.
But the most disturbing discovery was a collection of documents written on treated leather that had been preserved through environmental controls that maintained optimal humidity and temperature conditions for organic material conservation. The documents appeared to be official correspondence between indigenous leaders and European representatives, written in multiple languages, including Maya hieroglyphs, Spanish colonial administrative script, and Latin diplomatic terminology that suggested formal diplomatic relationships and treaty negotiations that weren't documented in official colonial records or contemporary historical accounts of indigenous European relations during early contact periods. The correspondence discussed resource extraction agreements, territorial boundary arrangements, and cultural exchange programs that indicated much more sophisticated relationships between indigenous American civilizations and European colonial powers than academic historians had documented in official accounts of conquest, colonization, and cultural destruction that formed a foundation of contemporary understanding about early American history and European colonial expansion patterns. The documents suggested that indigenous cultures had maintained political independence and economic negotiating power throughout extended periods of European territorial expansion, contradicting historical narratives that depicted indigenous peoples as passive victims of European technological and military superiority. Isabella had discovered additional hidden compartments within the chamber that contained artifacts representing multiple historical periods, suggesting that the space had been used as a repository for valuable items and sensitive documents throughout centuries of changing political circumstances and territorial control transitions. The compartments contained European colonial administrative documents, indigenous ceremonial objects, and hybrid artistic productions that showed sustained cultural exchange and cooperative relationships that challenged academic assumptions about cultural conflict and technological dominance patterns during colonial expansion periods. The environmental preservation within the chamber was too sophisticated to have been achieved through natural conditions or simple construction techniques, indicating ongoing maintenance and monitoring systems that had protected organic materials and metallic artifacts throughout decades of supposed abandonment when the mine had been officially closed and sealed. The preservation quality suggested access to advanced chemical treatments and climate control technologies that exceeded what would have been available to mining operations during the Luna Perdida's documented operational period, implying that the chamber had been maintained by people with specialized knowledge and resources throughout the entire period since the mine's official closure. As Catalina documented Isabella's discoveries with photographs and detailed notes that could support future authentication efforts, she began to understand that their $200 property purchase had connected them to historical secrets whose exposure could fundamentally alter academic understanding of North American development, European colonial practices, and indigenous cultural achievements in ways that would challenge not just scholarly consensus, but legal foundations of contemporary territorial claims, resource extraction rights, and governmental authority structures throughout the Americas. The implications were staggering in their potential consequences for contemporary politics, economics, and international relations. If the chamber's contents were authentic, they proved that official historical records had systematically concealed diplomatic relationships, treaty agreements, and cultural exchange patterns that could affect modern legal claims to territorial sovereignty, resource extraction privileges, and governmental authority over indigenous populations whose historical rights and political status had been deliberately misrepresented to justify European colonial expansion and contemporary governmental control over traditional territories and cultural resources. But Isabella's exploration had also revealed evidence that the chamber's concealment had been maintained through sophisticated security measures and ongoing monitoring systems that suggested contemporary interest in preventing discovery of materials that could challenge established historical narratives and their associated political and economic benefits. Electronic equipment hidden within decorative elements provided surveillance capabilities and communication systems that could alert external monitoring networks when unauthorized individuals gained access to sensitive materials, indicating that their discovery had potentially triggered automatic notification systems that could compromise their family's safety through involvement of people with unlimited resources and institutional protection. The chamber represented not just historical treasure, but active security risk that connected them to conflicts between powerful interests that had invested centuries in maintaining concealment of evidence that could destabilize established relationships between governments, corporations, and indigenous populations whose legal status and territorial rights depended on historical assumptions that this single repository of artifacts and documents proved to be systematically false and deliberately concealed through coordinated efforts involving multiple institutions and generations of participants willing to employ extreme methods to preserve secrets whose exposure could trigger fundamental changes in contemporary power structures and wealth distribution patterns.
As Catalina helped Isabella photograph and document their discoveries while simultaneously planning for the possibility that their exploration had made them targets for elimination by people whose authority and wealth depended on maintaining historical narratives that the chamber's contents could destroy, she realized that their desperate search for affordable housing had led them to an inheritance that exceeded anything she had imagined possible, while also creating dangers that could require immediate evacuation from property that had seemed like salvation, but might prove to be the most perilous location they could have chosen for refuge from the financial pressures that had driven them to seek isolated residences in remote Nevada desert terrain, where missing persons investigations rarely received sufficient resources to identify perpetrators with unlimited wealth and institutional connections.
The financial scale represented resources that would have constituted significant percentages of European national treasuries during the 16th century, suggesting that American indigenous civilizations had possessed wealth accumulation and monetary systems that far exceeded academic estimates of pre-Columbian economic capabilities. The document indicated that indigenous American cultures had developed sophisticated financial institutions, international trade networks, and resource management systems that could negotiate complex agreements with European colonial powers as economic equals rather than the subsistence-level societies that historical narratives had portrayed as being easily overwhelmed by European technological and organizational superiority. But the most shocking revelation contained in the Brotherhood correspondence was evidence that these collaborative relationships had continued throughout the entire colonial period and had evolved into contemporary institutional arrangements that maintained concealed influence over modern governmental policies, resource extraction operations, and international trade agreements, affecting both American and European economic systems. Letters dated from the 18th and 19th centuries showed that the Brotherhood had adapted their operational methods to accommodate changing political circumstances while preserving their core mission of coordinating resource extraction and wealth transfer agreements that generated revenues exceeding the gross domestic products of most nations. The organizations involved included multinational mining corporations, international banking institutions, and governmental agencies, whose official responsibilities provide perfect cover for activities that require access to natural resources, financial networks, and political authority systems. Isabella had discovered additional documents that identified specific contemporary organizations and individuals who continued Brotherhood operations under modern corporate and institutional structures. The names included executives from major mining corporations, officials from international banking institutions, and governmental administrators whose public positions provided authority to influence policies affecting resource extraction rights, environmental regulations, and indigenous territorial claims throughout the Americas. The document showed that these individuals coordinated their activities through secure communication networks and regular meetings that maintained their centuries-old mission while adapting to contemporary political and economic circumstances. But the most alarming discovery was evidence that the Brotherhood had been monitoring the Vasquez family specifically since Catalina's military service had brought her to the attention of intelligence networks that tracked individuals with technical capabilities and security clearances that could pose threats to operational security if they accidentally discovered Brotherhood facilities or activities. The monitoring had intensified during her transition to civilian life, when her financial circumstances and housing needs
had made her a candidate for manipulated real estate transactions that could position her family near Brotherhood facilities without her awareness of the true purposes behind property availability and pricing structures.
The documents revealed that the Luna Perdita mine had been made available for tax auction specifically because Brotherhood intelligence operations had identified Catalina as an ideal candidate for unknowing facility security services. Her military background provided technical competence and security awareness that would help protect the site from casual intrusion, while her financial desperation and family responsibilities made her unlikely to conduct investigations that could compromise operational security. The $200 purchase price had been calculated to attract her specific financial circumstances while deterring other potential buyers who might have different motivations for acquiring remote desert property. The manipulation extended to intelligence gathering about her daughter's personalities and capabilities, with detailed psychological profiles that had identified Isabella's curiosity and analytical abilities as potential security risks that needed to be managed through careful environmental controls and behavioral modification techniques. The Brotherhood had anticipated that Isabella would eventually discover the hidden chamber and had prepared response protocols that would determine whether the family could be recruited as willing participants in Brotherhood operations or would need to be eliminated as security threats that could compromise centuries of concealed activities. A recent document, dated just 3 months earlier, discussed activation of containment protocols for situations where civilian assets demonstrate excessive investigative capabilities that exceed operational security parameters. The language was bureaucratic, but the implications were terrifying. The Brotherhood possessed comprehensive plans for dealing with individuals and families who accidentally discovered information or facilities that threatened their operations, with response options ranging from recruitment and relocation to what was described as permanent operational security solutions that would eliminate threats while maintaining plausible deniability about their disappearance. The Brotherhood's contemporary capabilities were documented through technical specifications for surveillance systems, communication networks, and response resources that exceeded anything Catalina had encountered during her military intelligence training. Their operations included satellite monitoring networks, electronic surveillance systems, and rapid response teams with military-grade equipment and authorization to operate throughout the Americas without oversight from national governmental agencies that remained unaware of Brotherhood activities or lacked authority to investigate organizations whose legal foundations predated modern national governments and international law frameworks. The documents revealed that major archaeological discoveries throughout the Americas had been suppressed or manipulated to prevent public knowledge of evidence that supported indigenous claims to territorial sovereignty, resource ownership, and cultural achievements that contradicted official historical narratives supporting European colonial claims and contemporary governmental authority over traditional indigenous territories. Archaeological sites had been destroyed, artifacts had been relocated to Brotherhood facilities, and academic researchers had been discredited or eliminated when their work threatened to expose evidence that could support indigenous legal claims to territorial rights and resource ownership that would undermine existing corporate and governmental control over valuable lands and mineral deposits. The Brotherhood's influence over academic institutions, governmental agencies, and media organizations had enabled systematic manipulation of public understanding about American history, indigenous capabilities, and colonial relationships that supported contemporary political and economic structures benefiting European-derived institutions while maintaining indigenous American populations in conditions of political subordination and economic dependency that contradicted their historical status as partners in complex international agreements that had established their rights to territorial sovereignty and resource ownership. But Isabella's exploration had uncovered evidence that indigenous American organizations had maintained their own intelligence networks and resistance operations throughout centuries of supposed European domination, working to preserve evidence of their historical agreements and preparing for opportunities to reassert their territorial rights and political sovereignty when circumstances permitted open challenge to established governmental authority and corporate control over traditional territories.
The resistance networks had developed sophisticated capabilities for protecting sensitive information, maintaining secure communications, and coordinating activities across vast geographical areas, while remaining invisible to Brotherhood surveillance systems and governmental intelligence operations. The chamber contained communication equipment that connected to networks operated by indigenous resistance organizations throughout the Americas, providing secure channels for coordinating activities and sharing information about Brotherhood operations, governmental policies, and corporate activities that affected indigenous territorial rights and cultural preservation efforts. The communication systems had been monitoring the Vasquez family's situation and had prepared to make contact when circumstances indicated that they might be willing to assist resistance operations or required protection from Brotherhood elimination protocols.
A message received just hours earlier had warned that Brotherhood response teams were mobilizing for asset containment operations targeting the Luna Perdita facility and its current occupants. The intelligence indicated that Catalina and her daughters had approximately 18 hours before Brotherhood security personnel would arrive with equipment and authorization to conduct comprehensive site sanitization that would eliminate all evidence of the facility's contents and any witnesses who had gained knowledge of materials that could compromise operational security. The response teams possessed military capabilities and legal immunity that would allow them to operate without interference from local law enforcement or federal agencies, whose authority was insufficient to challenge organizations whose legal foundations and financial resources transcended normal governmental oversight capabilities. The indigenous resistance networks had prepared extraction plans that could remove the Vasquez family from immediate danger while providing them with protection, resources, and opportunities to contribute to efforts aimed at exposing Brotherhood operations and reasserting indigenous territorial rights through legal challenges supported by the documentary evidence that Isabella had discovered. The extraction would require immediate departure from the Luna Perdita facility and relocation to secure facilities where they would receive comprehensive briefings about the full scope of Brotherhood operations, indigenous resistance capabilities, and the historical context that made their accidental discovery potentially crucial to centuries-old efforts to restore political and economic justice throughout the Americas. But accepting assistance from indigenous resistance networks would transform them from accidental discoverers of historical secrets into active participants in conflicts between powerful organizations whose resources and capabilities exceeded anything that normal families could understand or manage safely. The choice involved not just their immediate survival, but their daughter's entire future development within contexts that would require them to maintain absolute secrecy about knowledge and relationships that could affect international political stability and economic structures whose disruption could trigger consequences affecting millions of people throughout the Americas and Europe. As Catalina read communications that revealed the true scope of what Isabella's curiosity had uncovered, she realized that their $200 investment in abandoned desert property had connected them to conflicts that had been ongoing for over 4 centuries between indigenous American civilizations and European colonial institutions that had evolved into modern corporate and governmental structures while maintaining their fundamental commitment to controlling American territories and resources through systematic deception about historical relationships and contemporary legal arrangements that could be challenged successfully only through evidence that powerful interests had spent centuries ensuring remained hidden from public knowledge and judicial review. The jade mask that had initially captured Isabella's attention represented not just archaeological treasure, but legal evidence that could support indigenous claims to territorial sovereignty and resource ownership throughout vast areas of North and South America that are currently controlled by governmental and corporate institutions whose authority depended on maintaining historical narratives that Isabella's discovery proved to be deliberately constructed falsehoods designed to conceal agreements and relationships that established indigenous rights to political independence and economic control over traditional territories that contained resources worth hundreds of billions of dollars in contemporary global markets. The electronic monitoring systems hidden within the chamber's decorative stonework had been transmitting detailed surveillance data for the past 6 hours, documenting every artifact that Catalina and Isabella had examined
every document they had photographed, and every communication they had intercepted through the indigenous resistance networks that connected the Luna Perdida facility to coordination centers throughout the Americas. The transmitted intelligence had triggered automatic response protocols within Brotherhood operational networks that deploy resources across 3 countries while simultaneously activating corporate security teams, governmental liaison personnel, and specialized elimination units whose combined capabilities could neutralize threats to operational security within hours of detection. Dr. Margaret Thornfield's voice emerged from communication equipment that had activated without Catalina's input, speaking with the authority of someone accustomed to managing complex situations that required immediate coordination between multiple agencies and unlimited financial resources. Mrs. Vasquez, my name is Dr. Margaret Thornfield, and I represent the Inter-American Cultural Preservation Foundation, which has been monitoring your family's situation since your unfortunate discovery of materials that require careful handling to prevent misunderstanding about their historical significance and contemporary legal implications. We understand that you've accessed documents and artifacts that could be misinterpreted as evidence of historical relationships that challenge established academic consensus and legal frameworks governing territorial sovereignty throughout the Americas.
The formal introduction eliminated any possibility that external contact had occurred through coincidence or casual observation of their activities. Dr. Thornfield's knowledge of their specific discoveries and her immediate availability for communication indicated surveillance capabilities and response coordination that exceeded anything Catalina had encountered during her military intelligence training. The reference to misinterpretation of documents that were written in multiple languages with official seals and detailed financial information suggested that powerful institutions were prepared to challenge the authenticity or significance of evidence that could support indigenous territorial claims and resource ownership rights. We represent institutions that have been preserving pre-Columbian artifacts and colonial period documents for over 4 centuries, ensuring that historically significant materials receive proper academic study and legal protection while preventing their exploitation by individuals or organizations who might attempt to use cultural heritage items for contemporary political purposes that could destabilize international relationships and economic systems that have evolved to protect the interests of all parties involved in complex territorial and resource management issues. Dr. Thornfield continued, her language carrying diplomatic precision that acknowledged their discoveries while reframing them as academic curiosities rather than legal evidence with contemporary implications. The communication system's activation revealed that the chamber had been under comprehensive surveillance since their arrival at the Luna Perdida property, with audio and video monitoring that had documented their conversations, recorded their reactions to specific discoveries, and transmitted real-time intelligence to coordination centers that possessed authority to make immediate decisions about response protocols and resource deployment. The surveillance wasn't hostile reconnaissance, but protective monitoring designed to assess whether the family represented security threats requiring elimination or potential assets who could be recruited into collaborative relationships that would benefit all parties while maintaining operational security for activities that transcended normal governmental or corporate oversight. The materials you've discovered represent one of several preservation repositories that were established during the colonial period to protect indigenous cultural heritage from destruction during periods of political instability and territorial transitions, Dr. Thornfield explained, apparently receiving real-time updates about their activities through monitoring systems that Isabella had inadvertently activated while exploring hidden compartments containing communication equipment. These repositories were designed to preserve cultural materials until circumstances permitted their proper study and legal integration into contemporary frameworks for protecting indigenous rights and cultural sovereignty within existing governmental and corporate structures.
But Catalina's military intelligence background had developed her ability to recognize institutional deception and propaganda techniques designed to reframe threatening situations as beneficial opportunities, making her immediately suspicious of explanations that portrayed discovery of centuries-old diplomatic correspondence and financial agreements as simple cultural preservation rather than evidence of systematic historical deception and contemporary legal fraud. Dr. Thornfield's careful language suggested institutional coordination and legal preparation that indicated the Brotherhood possessed comprehensive strategies for managing situations where their concealed operations were discovered by individuals who lacked sufficient knowledge or resources to challenge their authority effectively. The timing of contact was too convenient to represent normal academic or legal response to archaeological discoveries, suggesting that the Brotherhood possessed real-time intelligence gathering and rapid response capabilities that could coordinate multiple agencies and deploy specialized personnel within hours of threat detection. The coordination required sophisticated communication networks, pre-positioned response teams, and authority relationships that transcended normal governmental and corporate structures, indicating that the Brotherhood operated with resources and legal immunity that exceeded anything available through conventional institutional arrangements. However, Dr. Thornfield continued, recent developments in federal oversight of archaeological sites and indigenous cultural protection have created legal complications that require immediate relocation of sensitive materials to secure facilities where they can receive proper academic study and legal protection from exploitation by unauthorized individuals or organizations who might attempt to use cultural heritage materials for purposes that could compromise their historical integrity and contemporary legal status. The reference to federal oversight suggested that governmental agencies had become aware of Brotherhood activities and were conducting investigations that threatened to expose operational security and legal arrangements that had been maintained in secrecy for centuries. The need for immediate relocation indicated that the Luna Perdida facility was being abandoned as part of comprehensive security protocols designed to prevent governmental agencies from accessing evidence that could support indigenous legal claims or expose Brotherhood involvement in systematic resource extraction and territorial control activities throughout the Americas.
But the communication from indigenous resistance networks had provided context that reframed Dr. Thornfield's diplomatic language as threats disguised as protective offers. The resistance intelligence had identified Dr. Thornfield as a senior Brotherhood operations coordinator who specialized in managing situations where civilians accidentally discovered evidence that could compromise operational security. Her standard approach involved offering protective custody and financial compensation that would isolate potential threats while providing legal cover for their permanent disappearance if they proved unwilling to maintain silence about their discoveries. A second voice joined the communication, introducing himself as Colonel James Morrison, whose military bearing and tactical language indicated professional experience with operations that required coordination between civilian agencies and military resources. Mrs. Vasquez, your military background provides you with security awareness that allows us to discuss these matters with appropriate frankness about operational realities and security requirements that civilian families typically cannot understand or manage effectively. The materials you've discovered are protected under federal legislation that classifies unauthorized access as violations of national security statutes that carry mandatory imprisonment sentences, but your inadvertent discovery and lack of intent to compromise security operations provides opportunities for collaborative arrangements that could benefit your family while protecting sensitive operations. The legal threat was clear, despite diplomatic language that portrayed imprisonment as unfortunate consequence of federal legislation rather than Brotherhood influence over governmental agencies and legal systems. Colonel Morrison's reference to collaborative arrangements suggested recruitment opportunities that would provide financial security and legal protection in exchange for participation in Brotherhood operations and permanent silence about their discoveries. But acceptance of such arrangements would require relocation to controlled environments where their activities and communications could be monitored continuously to prevent security breaches that could compromise ongoing operations. The indigenous resistance networks had warned that Brotherhood recruitment offers typically involved comfortable imprisonment disguised as protective custody, with families relocated to secure facilities where they received excellent living conditions, educational opportunities, and financial resources while remaining under constant surveillance that prevented communication with external contacts who might exploit their knowledge of sensitive materials and operations. The arrangements could continue for generations, with children raised within controlled environments that provided superior education and career opportunities while ensuring their permanent loyalty to institutional objectives that transcended individual or family interests. Isabella had been listening to the communications with the analytical focus that characterized her approach to complex problems, asking questions that revealed understanding of tactical situations that exceeded typical 8-year-old cognitive capabilities. "Mom, why are they talking about protecting us from people who want to hurt us when they are the ones who have been watching us without permission and now want to take us away from our home?" Her question identified the fundamental contradiction in Dr. Thornfield's explanations, while demonstrating logical analysis that could prove problematic for recruitment approaches that depended on confusion and gratitude rather than informed consent. Dr. Thornfield's response carried subtle changes in tone that indicated recognition that standard manipulation techniques would be insufficient for managing a family whose military background and analytical capabilities made them less susceptible to emotional appeals and authority-based pressure than typical civilian targets. "Isabella, your question demonstrates exactly the kind of intelligent analysis that makes your family valuable partners in preservation efforts that require people who can understand complex situations and make decisions based on accurate information rather than fear or misunderstanding about institutional objectives and legal requirements." But the communication had been joined by a third participant whose voice carried different characteristics that suggested indigenous rather than European cultural background and organizational affiliation. "Catalina, my name is Dr. Elena Montoya, and I represent the Confederation of Indigenous Nations of the Americas, which has been monitoring Brotherhood activities and preparing legal challenges to their unauthorized occupation of traditional territories and systematic exploitation of cultural resources throughout North and South America. We have been aware of your situation and have prepared extraction protocols that can provide immediate protection while offering opportunities to contribute to legal proceedings that could restore indigenous territorial sovereignty and cultural heritage rights that were established through agreements that the materials you've discovered can authenticate in contemporary legal proceedings." Dr. Montoya's introduction revealed that the communication system connected to multiple networks with competing interests and conflicting objectives regarding the family's fate and the disposition of materials that could affect territorial claims worth hundreds of billions of dollars in contemporary real estate and resource extraction markets. The Indigenous Confederation represented legal interests that could benefit from exposure of Brotherhood operations and historical documents that proved indigenous territorial rights and resource ownership claims that had been concealed through centuries of systematic deception and institutional coordination. The Brotherhood's offers of protection and collaboration are standard protocols for managing security breaches that could expose their operations to legal challenges and governmental investigation, Dr. Montoya explained, her language carrying academic precision combined with political urgency that indicated extensive preparation for exactly these circumstances. Their protective custody arrangements involve permanent relocation to controlled facilities where families receive comfortable living conditions
while remaining isolated from legal representation and communication networks that could support challenges to brotherhood authority and operational security. The competing explanations created impossible choices between organizations whose resources and capabilities exceeded anything that individual families could evaluate effectively without extensive intelligence support and legal representation that could protect their interests while navigating conflicts between powerful institutions whose centuries-old disputes had evolved into contemporary struggles over territorial sovereignty, resource extraction rights, and legal authority that affected economic and political relationships throughout the Americas. Colonel Morrison's response indicated that Brotherhood monitoring had detected communication from indigenous resistance networks, triggering security protocols that eliminated diplomatic approaches in favor of direct action designed to secure the family and materials before competing organizations could implement extraction or legal protection measures. Mrs. Vasquez, the situation has become complicated by unauthorized involvement of organizations whose political objectives could compromise your family's safety and legal status. We are implementing immediate extraction protocols that will provide secure transportation to facilities where you can receive comprehensive briefings about your options while remaining protected from groups whose intentions may not align with your family's interests or security requirements. The language shift from collaborative offers to extraction protocols indicated that Brotherhood response had escalated from recruitment to containment operations that would secure the family regardless of their preferences or willingness to cooperate with institutional objectives. The military terminology suggested that Colonel Morrison possessed authority to deploy resources that could overcome resistance from family members or competing organizations whose intervention might complicate Brotherhood operational security and material recovery objectives. But Dr. Montoya's communication had provided tactical information that revealed Brotherhood response patterns and timing constraints that could be exploited through immediate action before their security teams could establish operational control over the Luna Perdita facility and surrounding territory. Catalina, Brotherhood extraction teams are approximately 40 minutes from your location, but our networks have prepared emergency evacuation routes that can remove your family from immediate danger while providing access to legal representation and protection services that exceed anything the Brotherhood can offer through their controlled custody arrangements. The competing extraction offers created tactical dilemmas that required immediate decisions based on incomplete information about organizational capabilities, legal authorities, and long-term consequences that could affect her daughter's entire future development within contexts that neither military training nor civilian experience had prepared her to evaluate effectively. The choice involved not just immediate survival, but permanent relationships with institutions whose conflicts transcended individual family interests in favor of larger political and economic objectives that could benefit or destroy them depending on decisions made under extreme pressure without sufficient time for careful analysis. Isabella's exploration had uncovered additional communication equipment that revealed the full scope of organizations monitoring their situation, including federal agencies whose involvement indicated that governmental authorities had become aware of Brotherhood operations and were conducting investigations that could result in legal proceedings affecting all parties involved in disputes over territorial sovereignty and resource extraction rights. The federal monitoring suggested that the Luna Perdita discovery had triggered comprehensive intelligence gathering and law enforcement response that could provide legal protection, but might also result in extended legal proceedings and governmental custody that would be more restrictive than either Brotherhood or Indigenous Confederation arrangements.
The electronic surveillance data being transmitted to multiple agencies created permanent records that could support legal proceedings, regardless of whether the family cooperated with specific organizations or attempted to maintain neutrality in conflicts between institutions whose resources and authority exceeded individual capacity for resistance or independent action. Their knowledge of sensitive materials and organizational operations had made them permanent participants in conflicts that would continue for years or decades through legal, political, and economic mechanisms that affected international relationships and territorial claims throughout the Americas.
as Catalina monitored communications between competing organizations whose representatives were coordinating response operations while simultaneously preparing for potential conflicts over custody of her family and control of materials that could affect territorial claims worth hundreds of billions of dollars. She realized that their desperate search for affordable housing had connected them to institutional conflicts that had been ongoing for centuries between indigenous American nations and European-derived organizations that continued to operate through contemporary governmental and corporate structures while maintaining their fundamental objectives of controlling American territories and resources through legal and economic mechanisms that could be challenged successfully only through evidence that Isabella's curiosity had accidentally discovered. The jade mask and associated documents represented not just archaeological treasure, but legal evidence that could trigger fundamental changes in territorial sovereignty and resource ownership throughout the Americas, making their families' cooperation essential for any organization seeking to control the political and economic implications of materials that could reshape contemporary understanding of indigenous rights and European colonial legitimacy in ways that would affect international relationships and economic structures whose stability depended on maintaining historical narratives that Isabella's discovery had proved to be systematically false and deliberately constructed to serve contemporary institutional interests rather than historical accuracy. The communication systems were receiving updates that indicated Brotherhood extraction teams had accelerated their deployment schedule and would arrive within 25 minutes with authorization and equipment to secure the facility and its occupants, regardless of resistance from competing organizations or federal agencies whose legal authority was insufficient to challenge operations that were protected through centuries-old agreements and contemporary institutional arrangements that transcended normal governmental oversight and judicial review processes that applied to conventional corporate and organizational activities. The sound of approaching helicopters thundered across the Nevada desert like mechanical thunder announcing the arrival of forces whose resources could reshape her family's existence within minutes, making Catalina realize that philosophical deliberation about competing organizational loyalties had become a luxury she could no longer afford when tactical survival required immediate action based on incomplete information about institutions whose centuries-old conflicts had converged on her daughter's future and their accidental discovery of evidence that could trigger legal battles affecting territorial sovereignty throughout the Americas. Isabella stood beside the jade mask with 8-year-old determination that transcended adult paralysis in crisis situations. Her analytical capabilities focused on practical solutions rather than abstract moral dilemmas about institutional authority and legal legitimacy. "Mom, they're all trying to control us because we found something that proves they've been lying about history. But we don't have to let any of them take us anywhere we don't want to go if we're smart about using what we know." Her daughter's clarity cut through the diplomatic complexity that had been designed to obscure simple realities about power, control, and family autonomy in situations where competing institutions sought to manage threats to their authority through recruitment, containment, or elimination strategies that subordinated individual interests to organizational objectives. The jade mask represented evidence that could expose systematic deception spanning 4 centuries, making their knowledge valuable enough that multiple organizations would invest unlimited resources to control their cooperation or ensure their silence. Dr. Montoya's voice carried renewed urgency as monitoring systems detected approaching Brotherhood extraction teams whose timeline had accelerated to immediate deployment. "Catalina, you have less than 15 minutes before Brotherhood security establishes perimeter control and prevents alternative extraction options. Our legal teams have prepared federal court filings that will trigger governmental protection protocols, but only if you can maintain physical custody of the jade mask and documentary evidence long enough for legal proceedings to establish judicial oversight of the situation." But Catalina's military experience had taught her that legal protection was meaningless without tactical advantages that could prevent hostile forces from achieving operational objectives before judicial processes could establish effective oversight.
the Brotherhood possessed resources and authority that exceeded normal law enforcement capabilities, making legal filings inadequate protection against organizations whose operations transcended conventional governmental jurisdiction and legal accountability mechanisms.
The communication systems revealed that federal agencies had been monitoring Brotherhood activities and had prepared their own response teams, but governmental intervention would result in extended legal proceedings that could separate her family for months or years while courts determined custody arrangements and evidence authentication processes that would subject Isabella and Esperanza to institutional control that might prove more restrictive than either Brotherhood or Indigenous Confederation alternatives. Isabella had been exploring additional hidden compartments, while adults debated organizational authority, discovering communication equipment that connected directly to satellite networks rather than terrestrial systems monitored by competing intelligence operations. "Mom, there's a way to broadcast everything we found to lots of people at once so that none of these groups can hide it anymore. But once we do that, we can never go back to normal life because everyone will know about us and what we discovered." Her daughter had identified the option that adult analysis had overlooked, transforming themselves from victims of organizational conflicts into public figures whose knowledge could benefit humanity while providing protection through visibility that made covert elimination impossible for organizations whose authority depended on maintaining operational secrecy. Broadcasting their discoveries would expose the Brotherhood's centuries-old deception while simultaneously documenting indigenous territorial rights and cultural achievements that academic consensus had systematically excluded from historical narratives. The tactical implications were profound and irreversible. Public exposure would provide protection from organizational elimination while creating opportunities to contribute to legal and political processes that could restore indigenous territorial sovereignty throughout the Americas. But visibility would eliminate privacy, autonomy, and normal family life in favor of permanent roles as historical witnesses whose testimony could affect international relations and economic structures involving hundreds of billions of dollars in territorial and resource claims. Dr. Thornfield's communication had detected their discussion of broadcast options, triggering final ultimatum protocols that eliminated diplomatic approaches in favor of direct threats designed to prevent public exposure that could compromise Brotherhood operations and legal arrangements throughout the Americas. Mrs. Vasquez, unauthorized disclosure of federal security legislation would constitute violations of federal security legislation that carry mandatory life imprisonment sentences for adults and permanent governmental custody for minor children whose parents have demonstrated inability to protect national security interests. But Isabella had already activated broadcasting systems that connected to internet networks, social media platforms, and news organizations throughout the world, beginning real-time transmission of high-definition images showing the jade mask, documentary evidence, and chamber contents that would provide permanent proof of indigenous cultural achievements and European colonial deception that could not be suppressed through organizational influence over governmental agencies or academic institutions. "Everyone needs to see this so they know the truth about what really happened when Europeans came to America," Isabella announced into recording equipment that was transmitting to global audiences whose real-time responses were already generating millions of views and international media attention that would prevent covert resolution of the situation through organizational coordination and authority manipulation. The broadcast had triggered automatic responses from news organizations, academic institutions, and governmental agencies throughout the world, creating international attention that exceeded any single organization's capacity for information control or public narrative management. Legal experts were analyzing documentary evidence in real time. Archaeological specialists were evaluating artifact authenticity through broadcast imagery, and indigenous rights organizations were preparing comprehensive legal challenges to territorial sovereignty claims throughout the Americas based on evidence that Isabella's curiosity had made available to global audiences. Within minutes, international media coverage had transformed their family from unknown civilians into the most famous archaeological discoverers in modern history,
while simultaneously making them the most protected individuals on Earth through visibility that made covert elimination impossible for organizations whose authority depended on operational secrecy. The Brotherhood's centuries-old control over historical narratives had been shattered through 8-year-old determination to share discoveries that could benefit everyone, rather than serving institutional interests that subordinated historical truth to contemporary power structures. As helicopter sounds intensified and multiple organizational response teams converged on the Luna Perdita facility, Catalina realized that Isabella's decision had transformed them from victims of institutional conflicts into agents of historical change, whose accidental discovery would reshape academic understanding, legal frameworks, and international relations in ways that honored both indigenous cultural achievements and their families' right to control their own destiny through choices that served human knowledge rather than organizational authority.
The jade mask would soon reside in international museums where global audiences could appreciate indigenous artistic achievements and cultural sophistication that European colonial narratives had systematically concealed for 4 centuries. The documentary evidence would support legal proceedings that could restore territorial sovereignty and cultural heritage rights throughout the Americas, while exposing institutional deception that had affected international relationships and economic structures since the colonial period. Their $200 investment in abandoned desert property had become a $500 billion archaeological discovery that would provide financial security through book deals, documentary opportunities, and consulting arrangements with academic institutions and legal organizations seeking to understand the full implications of evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about American history and indigenous cultural capabilities. But more importantly, their accidental discovery had exposed truth that would benefit humanity while protecting their family through visibility that made them more secure than any organizational protection could provide. Isabella and Esperanza would grow up as the children who changed history by sharing discoveries that restored dignity to indigenous cultures while exposing systematic deception that had shaped international relationships for centuries. Their future held opportunities for education, travel, and contributions to historical scholarship that would help ensure that such institutional deception could never again suppress evidence of human cultural achievements and rights to territorial sovereignty that transcended European colonial claims and contemporary organizational authority. As federal agents, Indigenous Confederation representatives, and Brotherhood security teams reached the Luna Perdita facility simultaneously, they found a family whose courage had already transformed them from desperate refugees into the guardians of truth, whose discoveries would reshape human understanding of American history and indigenous rights for generations to come.